You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Personally, I don't look at Ben being disloyal to the American cause. I mean, that's the question that we can ask because the Americans won, right? I think he had his own personal and professional reasons for leaving. I believe he may have thought the Americans couldn't win. What I do think, though, is that he was disloyal to his brother. He was disloyal to the other soldiers that he fought alongside of, and he was disloyal to his family. Because the other question I usually get is, if he deserted, why didn't he just go back home to Johnston? Why didn't he go back to his wife? And he didn't do that. And there's a reason I think he couldn't have done that, because I don't think he could have gone home to Johnston, Rhode Island, knocked on the door, and Rufus Frank was going to look at him with open arms and say, hey, come on in. Because I believe the first question that Rufus Frank would have asked him was, where's your brother?
Hello, and welcome to episode 434 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. What would you fight for if you were free, but still not equal? In 1777, two brothers, William and Benjamin Frank, answered that question by joining the Continental Army. They were free-born black men in Rhode Island, and they gambled that military service would earn them what freedom alone had not: equality, land, and a better future. But the American Revolution had other plans. By the war's end, one brother had served through the Battle of Yorktown. The other had crossed British lines and resettled in Nova Scotia as a Black Loyalist. Same family, same war, two different answers to the question of how do we achieve equality? Shirley Green, an adjunct professor of history at the University of Toledo and Bowling Green State University, as well as the director of the Toledo Police Museum, joins us to share this story. Shirley is the author of Revolutionary Blacks, Freeborn Men of Color, Soldiers of Independence, a book that grew out of her own family's oral history. Now, during our conversation, Shirley reveals what life was like for free Black families in early Rhode Island and how restrictive Black codes in Rhode Island shaped their daily existence. How the Frank brothers fought at the battles of Red Bank, Monmouth, and Rhode Island, only to see their integrated regiment segregated after Rhode Island's Slave Enlistment Act of 1778, and the dramatic story of how the American Revolution divided the Frank brothers, sending one to a post-war life in Rhode Island and the other to Nova Scotia as a Black Loyalist. But first, the History Explorers Club is a historian-led online membership for curious adults who want to explore early American history with more confidence, context, and community. If you love learning about history but wonder what sources to trust in our era of AI, misinformation, and agenda-driven storytelling, the History Explorers Club is for you. Each month, members join live conversations with guest historians, bring their questions and conversations to calls with me, and build real-world skills in our quarterly How Historians Know workshop. And because real life is real life, every event is recorded, so you can stay connected even if you can't attend live. So I hope you'll join us at historyexplorers.club. That's historyexplorers.club. All right, are you ready to meet two brothers whose choices during the American Revolution reveal just how high the stakes were for free Black men fighting for a country that hadn't yet decided it was ready to fight for them? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Joining us is an adjunct professor of history at the University of Toledo and Bowling Green State University. She received her PhD in history from Bowling Green State University after her 26-year career in law enforcement. Her research expertise is in African American history and the history of the American Revolution. She's the director of the Toledo Police Museum in Toledo, Ohio, and the author of Revolutionary Blacks, Discovering the Frank Brothers, Freeborn Men of Color, Soldiers of Independence. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Shirley Green.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're delighted to have you here, Shirley. Now, in Revolutionary Blacks, Shirley charts the journey of William and Benjamin Frank, brothers who joined the Second Rhode Island Regiment in 1777. Now, as members of the Second Rhode Island Regiment, the Frank brothers actually served in the Continental Army and fought at the battles of Red Bank on the Delaware River in 1777, Monmouth in June 1778, and the Battle of Rhode Island in August 1778. Shirley, historians always have great stories about how they find the people they research, and I wonder if you would tell us how you first became aware of William and Benjamin Frank. How did you find them in the archives?
We first have to talk about my grandfather, John Franklin. My grandfather was born and raised in Nova Scotia, Canada, and I was always interested in learning how he came to live there because I was born and raised in the Midwest in Toledo, Ohio. It was always kind of a badge of honor for me to have a grandparent that was born outside of the country. So I always believed growing up that my grandfather's ancestors made their way up to Nova Scotia, Canada by way of the Underground Railroad, that they were fugitive slaves. That's the traditional narrative, right? However, one day I was sitting in an undergraduate African-American history class that was being taught by Professor Nikki Taylor, who now teaches at Howard University. And she was talking about the first great wave of emancipation that happened after the American Revolution, where slaveholders and slavers in the old English colonies were starting to liberate their own slaves, caught up in the rhetoric of the American Revolution. And there were also fugitive slaves that ran to the British cause because the British promised them their freedom. And they were part of the group of Black Loyalists who were freed by the British and eventually made their way to Nova Scotia, Canada at the end of the war. And as Dr. Taylor mentioned that particular fact about Blacks living in Nova Scotia, my head popped up from taking my notes. And after class, I went up to her and I asked her, I said, my grandfather was from Nova Scotia, Canada. And she asked me the first time that anyone ever asked me this question, was he a Black Loyalist? And I said, I don't know. So I went home that night and called my mother up and asked her how my grandfather's people came to be living in Nova Scotia, Canada. And she said, oh, the Underground Railroad. And I said, I don't think so. So I called her older sister, who ironically had just moved to Rhode Island. My mother was born and raised in Lynn, Massachusetts. Her older sister had just recently moved to Rhode Island when I made this phone call. And I asked her, how did Pa's people, we call my grandfather Pa, how did Pa's people get to Nova Scotia, Canada? And she said, oh, the Underground Railroad. And I said, I don't think so. So we finally called their older brother, my Uncle Ben. And he was still living in Lynn, Massachusetts at the time. When I said, hey, Uncle Benny, how did Pa's people get to Nova Scotia, Canada? And of course, in his amazing way, he first said, I already told you. I said, no, you didn't. And then he related the Franklin oral history to me. And the Franklin oral history goes something like this, that the first Franklin male came to the United States from the west coast of Africa by way of Haiti, and then eventually made his way to Rhode Island, settled there, and two of his descendants, two brothers with the last name of Frank, fought in the Black Regiment out of Rhode Island within the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. And I told my Uncle Mitty, that's a great story. That's wonderful. This is the first time I've heard it. I've been able to corroborate all of those facts that are in the oral history. But after he told me the story, I said, that still doesn't tell me how Pa's people made their way to Nova Scotia, Canada. And that's when I started my research journey. And the book is the culmination of that journey.
What's fantastic about your book, Revolutionary Blacks, is that it's a family history. It's built on a lot of genealogical information. But it's also a really solid history book that uses historical practice and methods to find, read, and analyze historical sources about the Frank brothers and their fellow Black soldiers. So Shirley, would you tell us about the different sources and methodologies you used in your book and how your practices of genealogy and history overlapped as you worked on Revolutionary Blacks?
Whenever I present the book, I tell the audience that my book is part family history, part genealogy, and part microhistory. And microhistory is when you focus on a person or an event, a community, or a location on a very small level to tell a bigger story about historical forces and historical events. Now, most family histories and microhistorians start out on their research trying to answer questions or mysteries about a certain ancestor or a certain aspect of history. Now, when I started my research as a family historian, I was trying to answer the question of how my maternal grandfather came to be born and raised in Canada. As I started to address that particular question, another primary question came up. And that question was, how do the experiences of my ancestors inform us about the experiences and actions of free Blacks in revolutionary America? Because of the hybrid nature of my research, I had two sets of judges or review panels. On one hand, as a family history, I was under the scrutiny of family members. They wanted me to tell a positive story about our ancestors, but they also wanted to understand the conditions and circumstances under which they lived. And they wanted the real story about the Frank brothers to come out. As a historian, my work, which started as a dissertation, had to pass the standards of a dissertation review committee. And prior to the book's publication, had to pass the scrutiny of historians of the American Revolution. So I held myself accountable to both of those groups. And because of the hybrid nature of the research, I used microhistorical research methods along with genealogical research methods as well. I didn't have the luxury of any letters or memoirs or journals from the Frank brothers or those individuals that they served alongside of to provide me any type of insight into their lives. So as I encountered any kind of silences in the Franklin oral tradition, and the big silence, the big gaping silence, is the connection between these two brothers that fought in the Revolutionary War and Nova Scotia, Canada. I had to look in the archives and try to find and fill those gaps. But I also changed the focus from not just the Frank brothers, but the community of soldiers of color that they served with. And because of that, I could start to piece together individual profiles, and I was able to get a better understanding of their backgrounds, their service, and their motivations to serve, which allowed me in turn to understand the Frank brothers and their motivations to serve. I was able to compile a database of over 50 other soldiers of color that served with the Frank brothers in the Rhode Island Regiment. So as I started to piece together all of these profiles, I used sources that are traditionally used by historians, such as military records, pension records, muster rolls, journals, and diaries of other Revolutionary War soldiers, land and property records. But I also used records and sources that were used by family historians and genealogists. So, of course, the big one, the Stories Foundation, is based on the Franklin oral history. But I also use census records, marriage records, baptismal records, death records. And because it's my family, and it's part of family history, I had the availability of DNA genealogical testing to trace my family line, but also to verify the Franklin oral history. And it's amazing that the person who related the Franklin oral history to me was the person who was able to donate his DNA for us to verify their story. And my Uncle Ben was a match for an individual who lived at the time of the test in present-day Togo, which is located on the west coast of Africa. And this was the thing that I was really excited about. He was also a match for an individual that lived in the Dominican Republic, which shares an island with Haiti, the island of Hispaniola. So that was a wonderful way to corroborate the Franklin oral tradition with scientific information by using the DNA evidence from my Uncle Ben. But there are differences. And I want to give you an example of how my work as a microhistorian has a different standard than what family historians use, genealogists, as their standard of proof. So as I was piecing together the pre-war household of the Frank brothers, I started with military, census, and marriage records that listed their hometown. In their hometown, there was only one Frank household listed in 1774. And in that household, there were two adults, a male and female, two males under the age of 16, and one female under the age of 16. The only name listed in the census was the head of household. No other names were given. Now, the genealogical standard of proof would require a document which listed the names of all of those individuals who lived in that household. But I argue that the information that I used to piece together that household was proven by historical documents. So there's a difference there. But the great thing about microhistory and genealogy and how they overlap is in the uniqueness of the stories that can be told. As family historians and genealogists, they're trying to answer questions and mysteries that are hidden in these family histories. And I believe that the answer to those mysteries can lead to a larger exploration of underwritten stories, particularly about early American history.
I know we're anxious to dive into the stories of the Frank brothers and their military service, but before we do, I wonder if we could talk about the broader early American society that the Continental Army served in and around. What was it like to be a Black person in early Rhode Island? We know that Rhode Island was very active in the African slave trade, and yet it was just a society with slaves rather than a plantation-based slave society. So what was it like for the Frank brothers to live and grow up in early Rhode Island?
Based on the numbers from the 1774 Rhode Island census, there were around approximately 3,700 African Americans, Blacks, who lived in Rhode Island during that period of time. The majority of them were enslaved. As you said, by the early 1700s, Rhode Island merchants were the leaders in the slave trading business. Newport, Rhode Island was one of the largest slave trading ports in New England. I don't even think they were second to Boston. However, the first enslaved Africans who arrived in Rhode Island were not legally enslaved in perpetuity. There was this little tricky statute that the Rhode Island General Assembly passed in 1652 that prohibited lifelong servitude. And it may have been followed for a time, but that time was brief. And the General Assembly passed a series of laws before the beginning of the Revolutionary War that legally recognized the enslavement of Native Americans and Blacks. And by 1750, Rhode Island had the highest percentage of slave ownership in New England. Now, if you're asking about the day-to-day existence and experience of Blacks in Rhode Island, of course, it would depend on whether or not they were enslaved, freed, or free. An enslaved person in Rhode Island before the American Revolution, they were basically involved in three types of slaveholding. If an enslaved person lived in the wealthy seaport of Newport, most of them were house servants, or they worked on ships, they worked at the seaport, or they worked in the shops of merchants. In the southern part of the state, in regions like present-day Washington County, which the locals call South County, the enslaved worked on large farms that were located there, and they were used to produce foodstuff and other products that were ironically sold to feed the enslaved population in the Caribbean. And if an enslaved person lived in an urban area like Providence, Rhode Island, they worked at a variety of trades. They were skilled tradesmen, such as blacksmithing. They did mill work. They were carpenters. They fished, of course. And then some, of course, worked as domestic workers. The enslaved population could gain their freedom. Some had the ability to purchase their own liberty. If you were one of those urban workers as an enslaved man and you had a trade, a skilled trade, your enslaver sometimes would contract you out, hire you out to someone else for a fee. Now, of course, the fees usually went to the enslaver, but oftentimes they would allow the enslaved artisan to keep his wages, and then he may be able to save up enough of those wages to purchase his own freedom. Others could gain their freedom from grateful owners after many years of service. You can see that in the records sometimes. Some were freed upon their enslaver's death, and some gained their freedom through service in the colonial militia. Now, if you were freeborn or freed, your activities and your opportunities were very limited. Free Blacks could not vote. In terms of job opportunities, they were relegated to menial and lower paying jobs. They were discriminated against in housing and religious practices. They usually lived in the poorer sections of the town, and there were very limited opportunities, really limited opportunities for the education of free Black children. But in the 1774 records, you can see that there were some Blacks that lived near whites, probably poor whites. And if a free Black man owned their own business, it was usually in some version of food service. The other thing they had to deal with, my ancestors living during this period of time, were the Black codes. These legal statutes that were passed to govern the activities of enslaved and free Blacks. And the Black codes in Rhode Island were more prohibited than any other New England colony due to white officials' concerns over this large concentration of enslaved Blacks and free Blacks. There were curfews that outlawed free Blacks from walking the streets after 9 o'clock in the evening. They couldn't use ferries without a free pass. Free Blacks were prohibited from entertaining or having enslaved persons in their homes. There were also laws that prohibited enslaved persons from participating in any commercial transactions with any free person. So you're limiting all their economic opportunities. And this one is very interesting. In South Kingston, Rhode Island, there was a law that prohibited a free Black person from keeping horses, sheep, and other types of domestic animals. And these types of laws really prohibited free Black person from making a living. So because of these laws, there were limited opportunities for free Black men to make a living. Land ownership was tied to economic independence, of course, but few Black men owned farmland. And those were the types of things that really prohibited them from having any type of economic competency during this period of time. Many free Black men were general laborers. They were able to find work on farms, and some found work on whaling ships and merchant ships.
Okay, let's dive into the stories of William and Benjamin Frank. So in her book, Revolutionary Blacks, Shirley notes that land ownership and military service were both essential markers of manhood in early America. Shirley, you were just discussing the slave codes and other laws concerning slavery and the restricting of movements and really Black freedom in early Rhode Island for people who were enslaved or just living as free-born Blacks, like the Frank brothers. So with these laws in place, how was it even possible for Benjamin and William Frank to serve in the military during the American Revolution?
That is a great question. For the most part, in terms of allowing for military service was tenuous, and it was difficult for Black men due to a number of colonial statutes that for the most part prevented their service in the militia. So militia service was required for all able-bodied white men between the ages of 16 to 60. Black men were normally exempted from militia service, and they were instead required to perform other civic duties like road cleaning and road repair. However, race and necessity were often in conflict in determining whether officials permitted the use of Blacks as soldiers in the colonial period. And throughout that period, racial exclusion often limited Black men's participation in militias through laws that restricted or barred their service. But despite those barriers, military necessity would lead to an increased participation by Black men, often limited to support roles, but those roles could expand into arms-bearing roles during times of conflict when the battlefield needs outweighed exclusion based on race. So, militia service for Black men was usually limited to free Blacks if it was allowed. Enslaved Blacks could also serve in local militias during the colonial period and during the Revolutionary War. And in both periods, enslaved men could serve as substitutes for white men who had been conscripted into service. So despite all these laws, Black militia service occurred before the French and Indian War, before the 7 Years' War. Men of African descent fought in the major wars in the colonial period. They fought in King William's War in the 1690s. They fought in Queen Anne's War in the early 1700s. And they fought in King George's War in the 1740s. Now, there's another gentleman that comes under the Frank family umbrella by the name of Andrew Frank. And he died in 1755. And I believe he's a possible relative of the Frank brothers. But he was acknowledged upon his death in 1755 as being a veteran of the colonial wars. And I believe that his son, also named Andrew, would be part of the militia groups that would eventually march to Boston and lay siege to Boston after the initial battles at Lexington and Concord.
So in spring 1777, 18-year-old William Frank and his 16-year-old brother Benjamin joined the Second Rhode Island Regiment, which was a Continental Army regiment, and these brothers joined for 3-year terms. Shirley, as you know, when we study the American Revolution, we like to ask why someone decided to support the revolutionary cause, or why someone chose to remain loyal to Great Britain. Do you have any ideas of why the Frank brothers may have joined the Continental Army and decided to support the revolutionaries' cause?
That is a great question. And as I was doing my research, I was always praying that I would come across a letter or a statement in a pension application that allowed for me to understand why they joined. Of course, I didn't find that. And that's why I had to look at some of the pension applications and other records where other soldiers of color had talked about their motivation and the desire to serve. So the Frank brothers. Well, first off, their family were part of a large growing Black population before the American Revolution. There were approximately 500,000 people of African descent at that point in time, which made up 20% of the population. Most of them were enslaved. A very small percentage of Blacks were freed and lived under those restrictive conditions that I just talked about in the Black codes in Rhode Island. One of the best ways for me to understand what motivated people of African descent regarding their alliances and their allegiances during the war was whether or not they were free or enslaved. And I think historian Ira Berlin says it the best. He basically stipulated that if a Black person was enslaved, they were more than likely driven to go with the side that promised them their freedom, their liberty. And if they were freeborn or freed, they were more than likely to go with the side that promised them their equality. So since the Frank brothers were freeborn, I argue that they were motivated to serve with the Continentals as a means to gain equal footing and economic opportunities in a country where both were mostly denied to them. Many members of the working class, Black and white, and William and Ben Frank were members of the working class. They are listed as general laborers in quite a few records. They were more than likely trying to find a way to improve their economic conditions. And the appeal of steady pay for steady work must have been appealing to these young men, even though that did not pan out during their service during the Continental War because pay was very sporadic. But in 1777, at the time of William and Ben's enlistment, Congress had authorized a minimum cash enlistment bounty of $20. And free Black men like the Frank brothers received the same bounties as whites. And most importantly, for the Frank brothers, the promise of land at the end of service would be very important to them, especially enough acres that they could farm. I have been unable to find any documentary evidence that Rufus Frank owned land or owned farmland at the time of his son's enlistment. I imagine that the enlistment of both sons, leaving behind just an adult female, his wife, and a young girl to assist with keeping up a farm, kind of suggests that he had little land to bequeath to his sons. So the service with the Continental Army may have been one of the few avenues for William and Ben Frank to obtain land. At this point, Congress had authorized the payment of land allotments of 100 to 500 acres, depending on the rank of the soldier. So that would be enough of a motivation for the Frank brothers to sign up for service, especially if they're trying to achieve some sort of economic competency. And they probably believed that military service was a means to that end. And just one more thing. The Frank brothers were more than likely following in their father's footsteps. Now, I know we haven't talked much about their father up to this point, but in 1774, in the Rhode Island census, I find a family of Franks that are living in Johnston, Rhode Island. That is the hometown of the Frank brothers, and that is listed in military documents and marriage records, that they're from Johnston, Rhode Island. The head of the household of that one Frank household in Johnston, his name is Rufus Frank. And I believe Rufus is the father of William and Ben Frank. Now, I find Rufus in the military records in the 1750s during the French and Indian War, during the 7 Years' War. He served in multiple campaigns during that war. He served out of the Providence militia. He was living in Providence at that time. He served away from home during the French and Indian War. He served for the most part in upstate New York. After the end of the war, he came back to Providence and eventually moved his family to Johnston, Rhode Island. So if Rufus Frank was the role model for his sons, more than likely, he probably may have prompted them to join the military in a way to establish their manhood and in a way to establish their own households like he did during the 7 Years' War. Were the Frank brothers and other soldiers of color motivated by the ideology of the American Revolution? Now, I would imagine that they were more than likely hopeful that at the end of the revolution that they would gain the rights that were espoused in the Declaration of Independence. Even though they weren't enslaved, they were looking for equal treatment and equal economic opportunities. And I would imagine that they were thinking along those lines. Now, there are two individuals that talk about that kind of in the records. The first one is an individual by the name of Windsor Fry. Windsor Fry is the longest serving soldier of color in the Rhode Island regiments. He served from the very beginning of the war. at the Siege of Boston and all the way through the end of the war. He served for a total of 8 years. And in his pension application, he brags about the fact that he served on the American side for all those years and he only was absent one time. So there was some pride in his service as espoused by Windsor Fry. The other individual who thought it was very important for Black men to serve in the Continental Army was Prince Hall. Prince Hall is one of the founders of the Free Black Mason movement in the United States. He served in the Continental Army, and he advocated for Black male involvement in the two institutions that he believed provided a sense of masculinity in the Revolutionary period. And those two institutions, according to Prince Hall, was the military and Freemasonry. And early in the war, he petitioned Congress and General Washington to allow for the service of Black men because he believed that Black service would advance citizen rights for all Blacks, which included the abolition of slavery.
How much of a gamble do you think men like William Benjamin Frank made in joining the Continental Army with the hope of decent pay and free land? Actually, let's hold that thought for a moment and take a moment to thank our episode sponsors. And let's discuss this because, as we know, even in the colonial period, white Americans typically didn't live up to their promises when it came to people of color. Thank you for listening to Ben Franklin's World. Every episode of this podcast starts with a question. And in every episode, historians help us dig into the evidence, follow the surprises, and come away with a richer understanding of the past. That's what makes our community so special. You show up because you're curious. You want to know the real story that's grounded in research and scholarship and not in shortcuts and misinformation. Keeping this kind of podcast going takes real resources. Research, editing, and the creation of fact-check transcripts and show notes that make every episode useful long after you've finished listening. If Ben Franklin's World has deepened your understanding of early American history or introduced you to a story you didn't know, I'd love your support. You can donate once or become one of our monthly or annual supporters at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. And my sincere, heartfelt thank you to Mary B., Lori B., Stephen B., Linnea B., Susan B., Gwen B., and Eric B. for your generous support. Thank you for helping to make this work possible. Shirley, how much of a gamble do you think men like William Benjamin Frank took in joining the Continental Army with their hopes of decent pay and free labor? Because even in the colonial period, white American society often failed to live up to its promises of people of color. And then in the early days of the war, George Washington was quite famously appalled to find Black and Indigenous men in the New England regiments during the Siege of Boston. And he was so appalled, he actually wrote to the Continental Congress and encouraged them to prohibit the enlistment of men of color. And of course, this policy change meant that men of color in New England regiments served until their enlistments ran out. So you had these units where men of color were integrated, units where men of color were segregated. The Continental Army just ends up being this patchwork that by 1777 may have given men like the Frank brothers pause about enlisting in the Continental Army on the promises of free land, decent pay, and more equal treatment. So how much of a gamble do you think the Frank brothers took in joining the Continental Army?
That is the question, isn't it? So there were two things that really surprised me about my research. The first was that I actually had ancestors that fought in the Revolutionary War, that my family line went as far back as the colonial time period, and that they were free that long ago. That's number one. The second thing that was surprising to me was George Washington's attitude about the use of Black soldiers, especially since I was learning that my ancestors fought in the Continental Army. That's part of the Franklin oral tradition. So the good thing about focusing on free Blacks as opposed to enslaved Blacks and their service, because the traditional narrative is that, especially when I started researching about the Black Regiment out of Rhode Island, most of the stories that I found about the Black Regiment early on, and this has been a decade ago, started with enslaved men fighting in the Continental Army for their freedom. So if you start from that premise, it's not a bad story. You're allowing these enslaved men to sign up to fight for American independence and also to fight for their own independence. That's a great story. But if you start with the service of free or freeborn men, then it takes a whole nother dynamic. That is the wonderful thing about microhistory. By concentrating on the Frank brothers and their community of free men of color and tracing their service to before the enlistment of enslaved Blacks, a whole nother perspective opens up about the service of Black individuals. And it started to make more sense when compared to the service of Blacks during the colonial period. This whole issue of race, exclusion, and necessity completely warring against each other. So General Washington was completely flabbergasted when he arrived to take over command of the Continental forces, or those militia groups that were surrounding Boston in the summer of 1775. Okay? So he gets there and he is not happy. He is uncomfortable with it. George Washington's vision of a professional army did not include Blacks, and he tempered his recruitment policies, which reflected his sensitivity to the fears of Southern whites, like himself, concerning the army of Blacks as soldiers. And he directed his recruitment officers in July, after he took over command, not to enlist any Blacks in the service. So this order fell short of dismissing any Black soldiers already in active service, but it did prevent the enlistment of any new recruits, and it did prevent the re-enlistment of Black veterans who were already serving and had already served their initial terms of service. And I mentioned earlier about Windsor Fry. And Windsor Fry was one of those soldiers who was a militia member out of East Greenwich, Rhode Island. And he was part of the militia forces from Rhode Island that marched to Boston at the very beginning of the war. And he also participated on the periphery at the first major battle, or the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was really fought on Breed's Hill, which we all know now, right? So Windsor Fry and other soldiers of color from Rhode Island and the New England states were already there. George Washington sees them. Their terms of service are starting to expire. So once their terms of service expired, he told his recruitment officers not to re-enlist those individuals that were already veterans that had already fought there. But Washington and the Continental Congress would change their minds about the enlistment of Blacks as soldiers because they were prompted initially by the actions of John Murray. John Murray was the Royal Governor of Virginia. He's also known as the Earl of Dunmore. And Lord Dunmore was conducting his official business on a ship in the Chesapeake Bay because he had been run out of his headquarters in the capital city of Virginia by Patriot forces. Patriot forces had taken over. So while he was conducting his business, he decided in November 1775 to issue a proclamation. And that proclamation promised that any indentured servant or enslaved Black men or Native American men who came to the British cause and fought for the British cause, they would gain their freedom. Now, this proclamation resulted in masses of not just enslaved men, but enslaved men, women, and children starting to run to the British lines to gain their freedom. Now, the proclamation did result in an initial enrollment of like 300 formerly enslaved Black men whom the governor trained. He gave them uniforms. The uniforms were inscribed with, quote, liberty to slaves, unquote. They were designated as Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment, but his promises to those soldiers in the regiment were ill-fated. Nearly half of the regiment was killed at the Battle of Great Bridge in December of 1775, and many of the remaining troops died due to an epidemic of smallpox in the spring of the following year. But his action, his proclamation, caused the reaction, of course, by General Washington and the Continental Congress. So in December, the same month that the Ethiopian Regiment was fighting at the Battle of Great Bridge, Washington went back to his recruiting officers and he allowed them to enlist some Blacks to prevent them from flocking to British armies. And the Continental Congress agreed to allow for the re-enlistment of Black men who were veterans of the early battles of the war. So because of that policy change, it took effect in January 1776, individuals like Windsor Fry were able to re-enlist or enlist in the Continental Army. The following year, in January 1777, Washington is still dealing with manpower issues in the Continental Army. He again revised the enlistment policy to allow the enlistment of all free Black men. This change in the policy allowed for the Frank brothers to enlist. William, the older brother, enlisted in early spring, and the younger brother, Ben, enlisted the following month in May of 1777. Now, to get back to your question about how they may have felt given the policies that George Washington was enacting early in the war. First off, Rhode Island was tasked by the Continental Congress to produce at least 2 infantry regiments throughout the war. And those regiments were the 1st Rhode Island Regiment and the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment. The Frank brothers were enlisted into the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, but they served in different companies within the regiment. And both the 1st Rhode Island Regiment and the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment were integrated, meaning that white, Black, Native American soldiers, other soldiers of color, all served together. And this is where maybe they're thinking we're going to be treated fairly, because all of those soldiers received the same pay. They received the same assignments. They all went through the tough life of a Continental soldier all together. And I would imagine that as long as those regiments and companies were integrated, then the Frank brothers and other soldiers of color, other Black soldiers started to believe that we are going to be treated fairly and this is a good cause to fight for.
Were you able to find any information about how William and Benjamin Frank and their fellow Black and Indigenous soldiers, how they experienced daily life in the Continental Army? Were they even working as soldiers? Because quite famously, Black people who made it to British lines were almost always set to work digging trenches, doing laundry, and other menial but very essential labor-heavy tasks for the British Army. So was their treatment and service in the Continental Army any different?
So to give you a general idea of the number of Black men who served in the Continental Army, the traditionally accepted number is 5,000. New research and scholarship has pushed that number anywhere from 7,000 to 8,000. And they're counting Black men that served in the local militias and the state brigades. So you have a large number of individuals serving there. You did have Blacks who served in support roles, which you were just talking about. Some Blacks came to the Continental Army as valets and servants to their enslavers, and they worked for them during the war. And some of them were tasked with transporting supplies and equipment and building fascines and things of that nature, digging trenches. The Frank brothers and the soldiers in the Continental Army, they were arms bearers. They served in combat roles. So that was a unique experience for them as well. But having said all that, and I said earlier that all of these different ethnic groups survived and suffered together, and they did suffer. And to kind of give you a descriptive overview about the lives of the Frank brothers in the Second Rhode Island Regiment during their first year of service, they were under the overall command of Lieutenant Colonel Israel Angel. Israel Angel wrote back to the Rhode Island General Assembly about the condition of his troops. And he said in a letter that when the Second Rhode Islanders marched through various towns and villages, that they were called, and these are his words, quote, the naked, ragged, lousy regiment. And that indicates that they were not properly clothed and they were dealing with clothing that was infested with lice. So they weren't living a very great existence their first year. Both groups, all of them, white, Black, Native Americans, faced shortages in pay and uniforms, footwear, and rations. They had to deal with disease in camp. There was a smallpox epidemic throughout the war. And that gives you a general idea how tough it was for the Frank brothers and the other members of the Second Rhode Island Regiment. But they all experienced this together. They fought in major battles. They fought in one major battle their first year of the war at the Battle of Red Bank. Both of the regiments were dispatched to defend the forts along the Delaware River, Fort Mercer and Mifflin, in October of 1777. They were initially able to defend Fort Mercer at Red Bank and repel British and Hessian forces, but the British were able to capture Fort Mifflin, and that forced all of the regiments to evacuate both forts. And after that major battle in their first year of service, they marched off to the winter encampment at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania in 1777 and 1778.
Now, in addition to being a revolution, the American Revolution and its war for independence was also a civil war. It divided families, friends, neighbors, and it even divided the Frank brothers. While William Frank remained loyal to the Continental Army and the Revolutionaries' cause, Ben Frank deserted or self-furloughed sometime in 1780. Shirley, Do you have any idea why Ben Frank might have deserted the Continental Army and what he did after he self-furloughed?
To begin to explain and begin to understand how I looked at Ben Frank's desertion for self-furlough, we have to go back to the Valley Forge winter encampment of 1777 to 1778. So we all know how horrific it was, and that the American forces that were there suffered major losses due to disease, illnesses, and desertion. Food rations were in such short supply. You had Army regulars that were threatening to revolt because there wasn't enough food. At the end of that year, 1777, Washington wrote back to Congress that over 2,800 soldiers were unfit for duty because they were either barefoot or otherwise naked, meaning they didn't have the proper uniforms to wear. William Frank was one of those soldiers that were reported as being unfit for duty. A week later, Washington reported that 1,000 men were on the sick roll and that 3,000 soldiers had deserted. And the Rhode Island regiments were decimated as well. And due to their losses, remember Rhode Island's a small state, due to their losses, there were barely enough soldiers left to form one regiment. So to solve this problem, the overall commander of the Rhode Island regiments, a guy by the name of James Varnum, made the recommendation to General Washington in order to fill the Rhode Island dwindling ranks. They could go back to their home state of Rhode Island and they could recruit and enlist enslaved men. And here's the important part, in return for their freedom. So Varnum was able to convince General Washington of that plan. He was also able to Washington was able to convince the Rhode Island General Assembly. They passed a law. The law is called an Act to Allowing Slaves to Enlist in the Continental Battalion. They passed the Slave Enlistment Act in February of 1778. I like to say I'm sure they didn't realize that they were passing this monumental act during Black History Month. But the act did allow enslaved men to serve for their freedom. It also ensured them equal pay, equal bounties, and it also compensated their enslavers. So, of course, there were opponents to the act, and the result of that opposition, the act would be eventually repealed by June of 1778. But during the time period of open enrollment, approximately 100 enslaved men signed up to serve with the Rhode Island Regiment in the Continental Army. This is where I cannot find the records. All I can look at is the number of transfers. But for some reason or another, the recruitment enlisted and the addition of these approximately 100 formerly enslaved men caused what military historian, a guy by the name of Robert Wright Jr., he has called it, quote, an experiment in segregation, unquote. Because after the enlistment of these formerly enslaved men, the Rhode Island regiments became segregated. All the white soldiers in the 1st Rhode Island were transferred to the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment under the command of Israel Angel, and all of the soldiers of color from the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, including the Frank brothers, were transferred to the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, where they were merged with the 100 formerly enslaved men to form a new 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which would become known as the Black Regiment. And that regiment was under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Christopher Green. Now, up to this point, the Frank brothers and the other soldiers of color in the Rhode Island Regiment were treated the same, received the same assignments as their white counterparts. They served in the infantry, they served as arm bearers and in combat roles. And they did go on to fight 2 major battles after the reconfiguration of the Rhode Island Regiment, after the Slave Enlistment Act. But after a major battle that was fought on their home soil in Rhode Island, which took place on Quinnipiac Island, after that battle, the veteran soldiers, along with their new regiment mates, were assigned to shore patrol duty in the mainland of Rhode Island. So while they're on shore patrol duty, Ben Frank does what younger brothers do. They make a bad decision, and he gets married. He gets married in January of 1779. This is while the Black Regiment are on shore patrol duty. He marries a young woman by the name of Sarah Wilbur. He's married by Elder John Gorton of the 6th Principal Baptist Church in East Greenwich, Rhode Island. Sarah was a mother of one child by the name of Abraham. This was not one of Ben's smartest moves. Why would you get married when you are not financially able to support a new wife and a child? Because Continental Army pay was sporadic, and we know that Ben was unable to take care of his family because his wife, Sarah Frank, petitioned the Providence Town Council during the war for financial support for herself and her child. The council initially refused her request, but they eventually provided enough funds for her and her child to return home to their hometown of Middleborough, Massachusetts. So Ben had that going on. And they are also back in their home state, away from the main army, away from the Second Rhode Island Regiment, their original regiment. They are tasked with support roles now. They are tasked with making fascines. They are not fighting any battles with their white counterparts. And maybe Ben thought that they were starting to be treated differently. As I was trying to understand his motivation to desert, I looked at any possible issues in his personal life and issues in his professional life as a soldier. It wasn't uncommon for Revolutionary War soldiers to desert, but it was uncommon for Black soldiers to desert. So as I started to analyze and look at Ben's desertion or self-furlough, I looked at that community of freeborn or freed soldiers before the Slave Enlistment Act and segregation. And before the Slave Enlistment Act and segregation, only three of those 50 individuals that I tracked deserted. One deserted during the Valley Forge winter encampment, and two deserted their first year of service, which was kind of normal for young soldiers trying to deal with Continental life. All three of them were retaken and returned to service. After service, after the act and segregation, 17 members of that cohort deserted, including Ben Frank and his brother-in-law, Solomon Wotton. Solomon Wotton was another soldier of the First Rhode Island Regiment who got married to Ben's younger sister, Hannah, during the war. He deserted as well, but he was retaken and he would later die of disease in camp. So I believe that Ben had any number of issues going on in his head. Number one, he had this personal life that he was dealing with. He was not able to take care of his family financially. His wife is going to the Providence Town Council to deal with her own financial issues. He is now relegated to a regiment that is left in their home state making fascines. They had fought in major battles. They retreated from those three major battles. He lost comrades as a result of that. And even though the French were now allied with the American troops, they were supposed to be there at the Battle of Rhode Island. And the French had to flee because of the storms and they had disrepaired their ships. So Ben may have believed that the Americans were not going to win. And maybe he thought that his treatment was being unfair. And that could have been why he and others deserted during that period of time. Because the number just jumps like crazy from 3 to 17. That's amazing.
So you started this project with a question. How did your grandfather's family end up in Nova Scotia? And then you found your answer. Your family has roots in Nova Scotia because of Ben Frank. Were you able to find out any information about Ben's activities after he self-furloughed? Were you able to find out how and why he made his way to Nova Scotia?
That is the real tricky part of my research. Because after Ben Frank's desertion, he disappears from all of the records. Can't find him anywhere, with the exception of a record that I found in 1830s Massachusetts census. And I know for a fact that Ben is already living in Canada at this point in time. And he's an older person. It was difficult to track Ben after he disappears from the official records. I was able to track his brother William throughout the rest of the war. William served throughout the rest of the war. He served for the duration of the war. He served at the Battle of Yorktown. He is furloughed at the end of the war. He goes back home to his hometown of Johnston, Rhode Island, and he is listed in the 1790 federal census. Ben is not. So as we were researching our ancestors in Nova Scotia, there was a Nova Scotia local historian who informed us that maybe you need to check in the Book of Negroes. Maybe your ancestor is there. And she pointed us to an individual by the name of Ben Franklin, who was listed in the Book of Negroes. And given the age of Ben Franklin and the age of Ben Frank, they matched. And I believe that this individual, Ben Franklin, was my ancestor, Ben Frank. I think somehow or another, he connected with British Army, the British side. I'm not able to find any listing of Ben fighting with any of the provisional troops or serving as a member of any of the groups like the Black Pioneers. But Ben Franklin is carried on a list of Black Loyalists who served with the Wagon Master General's Department, which may indicate his role after leaving the Continental Army. They were responsible for maintaining the horses and carts and transporting equipment and supplies to troops in the field. So Ben Frank goes to Ben Franklin. And as we started to trail Ben Franklin, I started to understand it provided a bridge to connect those two disconnected stories of these two young men that fought for the Black Regiment in the Continental Army and Ben Franklin, who lived in Nova Scotia, Canada. The Book of Negroes was compiled as an inventory of Blacks who were behind the British lines by November of 1782. That was part of the Paris Peace Treaty that the British had to return all of the confiscated property to its rightful American owners. That included all of those enslaved people that ran to the British line because of Dunmore's proclamation and other proclamations. The British general in charge of the British forces at the end of the war, Guy Carleton, refused to return many of the fugitive slaves. And as a means to compensate their owners, he decided to compile an inventory. That inventory turned into the Book of Negroes. The inventory was taken by a commission led originally by General Samuel Birch and later by General Thomas Musgrave. They were tasked with compiling the inventory, and all of the Blacks who were behind British lines at the end of the war in New York City, and that's how I know Ben was in New York City, had to present themselves to this commission, give the names of their former owners, and then the commission would make a general note about how this person looked. And then, like I said earlier, that inventory took place in New York City, and Ben Franklin is listed in the Book of Negroes along with over 3,000 other Black Loyalists.
Something I wondered as I read Revolutionary Blacks was how you and your family reacted to the news that your ancestor Ben Frank had turned away from the revolutionary cause. How did this research help your family better understand who they are and where they come from?
I guess it depended on the family member you talked to. They all accepted it because it's in the records. He deserted. It's in the compiled service records. It's on the listing of muster rolls. I have copies of all of that stuff. So he deserted. And that is the one thing that explains how the Franklin family came to be living in Nova Scotia. So you can't disregard that, even though you wanted to. I think you have to understand his desertion from the perspective of Ben. And that's what I was trying to do when I wrote about it in the book. And that's why I looked at the number of other soldiers that deserted during the same period of time as Ben did. Personally, I don't look at Ben being disloyal to the American cause. I mean, that's the question that we can ask because the Americans won, right? I think he had his own personal and professional reasons for leaving. I believe he may have thought the Americans couldn't win. What I do think, though, is that he was disloyal to his brother. He was disloyal to the other soldiers that he fought alongside of, and he was disloyal to his family. Because the other question I usually get is, if he deserted, why didn't he just go back home to Johnston? Why didn't he go back to his wife? And he didn't do that. And there's a reason I think he couldn't have done that, because I don't think he could have gone home to Johnston, Rhode Island, knocked on the door, and Rufus Frank was going to look at him with open arms and say, hey, come on in. Because I believe the first question that Rufus Frank would have asked him was, where's your brother? So he had no answer for that. So I think that's why he decided to go to the British cause. There may have been other reasons because, like I said, there were a number of soldiers who deserted during that period of time. And maybe he and another soldier decided together to leave. I don't know. I wish I did. But I do know that he did go to the British cause as a Black Loyalist. They waited there in New York City, and he was part of a Black Loyalist migration wave to Nova Scotia, Canada, which took over 10 months to complete. There were 81 ships in 3 main waves that took these Loyalists, Black and white, to Nova Scotia. There were approximately 20,000 of them that eventually settled in Nova Scotia, Canada. And 3,000 of them were Black Loyalists, and Ben Frank, now Frankham, was one of them.
Well, the story of Ben Frankham is also quintessentially an American story. And I say this as someone who has revolutionaries and some loyalists in my family tree. The American Revolution, as we've noted, was a civil war, and choosing a side was a tough choice for people. And people did sometimes waver. When they picked one side, they might go back to the other, or sometimes they became disaffected from both sides. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, before we move into our 1776 and context segment, could you tell us whether the Frank brothers' gamble on military service leading to land paid off? Did the Continental and British armies make good on their promises of post-service land and money to the Frank brothers?
Well, for William Frank, he eventually got his back pay. And he also eventually got his land bounty, which he promptly signed away to a land speculator, making the decision to remain in Johnson, Rhode Island, as opposed to going out and settling on the land that was in the military reservations to the west. So for William, did he achieve some version of manhood as exampled by his father? At the end of the war, he was leading his own household. He is listed in the 1790 census. So I think he was able to accomplish that. For Ben, living in Nova Scotia, Canada, as a member of the Black Loyalist group, it was tougher. They were also promised land, but the Black Loyalists were, for the most part, put on the bottom of the list of land allocation. And it was so bad that a group of them decided that they were no longer going to wait for the British government, British officials to give them their 100 acres of land. And in 1792, a group of Black Loyalists, led by some of the veterans of the Black pioneers, took the chance, decided to resettle in a colony in Sierra Leone, Africa. More than half of the Black Loyalists that were living in Nova Scotia, nearly 1,200 of them, left Nova Scotia and moved permanently to Sierra Leone. One of those individuals was Henry Washington, who was formerly enslaved to George Washington. I like to tell that. But that migration to Sierra Leone did not include Ben. And if you look at the stories of the narratives about Black Loyalists, the story begins with their evacuation from New York City, their arrival in the tough conditions in Nova Scotia, and then their decision to go to Sierra Leone and kind of forget about the Black Loyalists that stayed behind. So that was really interesting part of my research to look at why Ben stayed and why others left. And Ben did stay. He was now calling himself Ben Franklin. He eventually remarried. He married the daughter of another Black Loyalist, and he eventually settled in a town on the west side of the Nova Scotia Peninsula in Granville Ferry, Nova Scotia. He and his wife had 9 children who'd survived to adulthood. All of them were baptized in the Anglican Church. Ben did at some point in time obtain 100 acres of land that he mortgaged off and used as leverage to gain some funding. He never did really live on that land. And he was also able to obtain a fish lot where he had the fishing rights in that land. So he did achieve temporarily some economic competence, and he was at least the head of his own household in Nova Scotia, Canada.
Well, now it's time for our segment, 1776 in Context. As we're now in the midst of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, Shirley, what do you think we can gain from researching and learning more about the everyday experiences of Black soldiers and their families during the American Revolution? In what ways do you think the experiences of these Black soldiers, like the Frank brothers and their families, add to our knowledge and understanding of the Revolution?
I think if you start to look at the everyday experiences of Black soldiers and their families during the American Revolution, it helps to provide a more complex understanding of what motivated people of color when determining their allegiances during the war. And it helps to really challenge any simplified narratives of Black soldiering during the Revolutionary War. And it forces you to try to understand the decisions that were made by the more recognized founding fathers during the American Revolution, George Washington in particular, how he was anti-Black soldiering. And then, of course, he had to change his policies because of manpower issues and some of the actions of the British during the war. So I think that is probably the most important part of looking at the Frank brothers and the day-to-day existence of Blacks during the American Revolution. But for me also, when I talk about my own family's experiences during the American Revolution, especially to the classes that I teach at the University of Toledo and Bowling Green State University, or going out into community and talking about my family's history, it forces the students and other African Americans to check into their own family history to see how their own family is linked to some of these more important events and major issues that happen in early American history, because I think students in particular only think of their existence in the 21st century. And normally after telling my story in class, students will come up to me a week or so later and say, hey, I went back and talked to my grandmother or my grandfather, and one of my ancestors fought in World War I. And they start to make a connection with American history. And that is probably one of the most important things for me.
Shirley, are you like many historians in that you started a new research project while you were finishing Revolutionary Blacks?
Definitely. I am currently working on another microhistory, but this is on the police side now. And I am looking at the first Black police officer in the city of Toledo. It's a guy by the name of Albert King, and he was hired pretty early in 1887. And his history has some of the same aspects, which is really funny, to the Frank brothers. All right, because he is from Canada. He was born and raised in Toronto, and he came here to Toledo to serve on the Toledo Police Department. He is an example of living as a member at the turn of the 20th century, as a member of the middle class in Toledo, Ohio. He was friends with individuals that own their own photography businesses, own their own hotels, and I'm talking about other Black men during this period of time. His wife, her narrative is captured in the WPA slave narratives that were recorded in the 1930s. I mean, his life story is just sitting there waiting for us to analyze. And I think researching into his life also dispels some of the myths and misconceptions of Black policing at the turn of the 20th century, which researching the Frank brothers also helped to dispel some of the myths about Black soldiering during the Revolutionary War. And the other thing about Albert King is he was a playwright. He wrote plays and he was an actor. And he went around town performing Shakespeare at certain events in the city. So he's a really interesting guy. So that's what I'm working on right now.
Now, if we have more questions about the experiences of freeborn Blacks in the Continental Army or the Frank brothers, where is the best place for us to get in contact with you?
I can be contacted by email at shirley.green@utoledo.edu. I can be also contacted at my website, shirleygreenphd.com. And you can also contact me through the Toledo Police Museum at Toledo Police Museum, all one word, Toledo Police Museum @gmail.com.
Shirley Green, thank you for introducing us to the experiences of freeborn Black soldiers in the Continental Army and for sharing your family's history with us.
Well, you are more than welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
The story of William and Benjamin Frank reminds us that the American Revolution was not one experience, but many experiences. The choices that people made during the War for Independence were shaped just as much by personal circumstances as they were shaped by grand ideals. As Shirley showed us, the Frank brothers were freeborn men of color who joined the Continental Army not for their freedom, but for something just as essential: equality, economic opportunity, and the chance to own their own land. Now, William and Ben's father, Rufus Frank, had served in the military during the colonial wars, and the brothers followed in his footsteps, hoping that military service in the Revolution would open doors that Rhode Island's restrictive Black codes had kept shut. And yet, even within the Continental Army, the promise of equal treatment proved fragile. After Rhode Island's Slave Enlistment Act in 1778 brought formerly enslaved men into the ranks, the integrated Rhode Island regiments were segregated. The Frank brothers and their fellow free soldiers of color were transferred from the Second Rhode Island Regiment to the First Rhode Island Regiment, and they were shifted from combat roles to support duties. This broken promise of equality may have been part of what drove Ben Frank to desert the Continental Army and eventually cross over to the British side as a Black Loyalist. Now, what's striking about the Frank brothers' story is how it captures the full range of Black experiences during the Revolution. William stayed with the Continentals, he served through the siege of Yorktown, and then he returned home to Johnston, Rhode Island at the end of the war. But Ben left the Continental Army. He joined the British cause and resettled in Nova Scotia as part of the Black Loyalist migration. In doing so, Ben became the ancestor whose journey led Shirley to write Revolutionary Blacks. Now, as we commemorate and celebrate the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, the Frank brothers' story challenges us to think beyond the simplified stories of patriotism and loyalty. For free Black men like William and Benjamin Frank, allegiance to a side was not a foregone conclusion. Allegiance was a calculated gamble shaped by promises made and promises broken. Look for more information about Shirley, her book, Revolutionary Blacks, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/434. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoyed this episode, please forward it and share it with a friend or family member. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, the Frank brothers made very different choices during the American Revolution. If you had been in their shoes, a free Black person in Revolutionary Rhode Island, what side do you think you would have chosen and why? I'd love to know, so tell me. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com.